HMS Amphion on August 6, 1914. 2 days after Britain declared war on Germany, HMS Amphion, a British light cruiser, became one of the first Royal Navy ships lost in the First World War when she struck a mine laid by the German auxiliary mine layer Königin Luise in the North Sea. The timing gave the disaster its particular cruelty. HMS Amphion had actually sunk the Königin Luise the previous day, the first naval action of the war, returning home with German survivors aboard when it struck one of the very mines the Königin Luise had just laid. The explosion killed 150 British sailors and 18 of the German prisoners they were transporting. A second explosion followed shortly afterward that wrecked the ship's forward section entirely. Amphion had to be abandoned and sank within the hour. The German auxiliary had been laying mines in the main shipping lane between Britain and the continent, an area that British warships used constantly, and had done so in the final hours before she was intercepted and sunk. No one had known the mines were there. 2 merchant ships had already struck them and sunk in the 24 hours before Amphion hit one, but communications between those incidents and the Amphion's command had not reached the ship in time. It was within the first week of the war, a demonstration of what would become the defining hazard of both world wars at sea mines laid in routine sailing areas could sit and wait for any ship from any direction, at any moment invisible, impatient, waiting for a hole to come within range. Britain responded by declaring the entire North Sea a military area and restricting civilian shipping to narrow, supervised passages, a decision that changed the commercial and economic geography of the North Sea for the remainder of the war. The Königin Luise had laid her mines and been destroyed within 24 hours of the war's beginning. Her mines went on killing for weeks. HMS Audacious. On October 27, 1914, the British super dreadnought battleship HMS Audacious, one of the most powerful and most expensive warships in the Royal Navy, departed Loch Swilly in Ireland with her battle squadron for routine gunnery exercises and struck a mine barely an hour after leaving port. The mine had been laid the previous night by the German auxiliary mine layer SMS Berlin in a field the British had no knowledge of, positioned precisely across the route the British Grand Fleet was using, while its main base at Scapa Flow underwent defensive improvements. The blast flooded the Audacious's engine rooms almost immediately, leaving her dead in the water and listing dangerously. A 13-hour rescue and salvage operation followed, involving the White Star Ocean liner, RMS Olympic sister ship of the Titanic, plus multiple cruisers and destroyers, all attempting to tow the stricken battleship to shore. Just before 9:00 in the evening, after hours of flooding and failed towing attempts, Audacious finally sank and rolled over her magazines, detonating in a final explosion that threw debris onto the deck of HMS Liverpool nearby and killed one man. The loss of a King George V class super dreadnought to a single mine in the first weeks of the war was so embarrassing to the Admiralty that the British government suppressed all news of the sinking, issuing a gag order to every newspaper and photographer who had witnessed the rescue. The cover-up lasted until after the war. It was not the last time a government would find the political consequences of a mine disaster as damaging as the military ones. HMS Hampshire. On June 5, 1916, the British armored cruiser HMS Hampshire departed Scapa Flow carrying one of the most important passengers in the British Empire field, Marshal Horatio Herbert, Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, en route to its secret mission to Russia to meet the Tsar and coordinate the Allied strategy. Only days after the Battle of Jutland, the North Sea was alive with mines and submarines, and Hampshire's captain chose a westerly route that was supposed to be safer. What he did not know was that the German submarine U-75 had laid a fresh minefield along exactly that route just days before, specifically targeting the waters west of the Orkneys. Hampshire struck a mine and sank in approximately 15 minutes, in conditions of heavy sea and freezing wind. Of the 655 officers and men aboard, plus Lord Kitchener and his party, only 12 survived, all of them able-bodied sailors who made it onto Carly floats in the first minutes of the sinking. Kitchener himself was never found. The cliff faces along the Orkney coastline made conventional rescue efforts nearly impossible, and boats dispatched from shore were turned back by the conditions. The death of Britain's most iconic military figure, the face of the famous "Your Country Needs You" recruitment poster, was a shock to the British public that went beyond any ordinary naval loss. His death on a mine, rather than in battle on a diplomatic mission, rather than in command, added a futility to the loss that the government struggled to frame in any redemptive way. Dardanelles Campaign, Bouvet, and others. On March 18, 1915, the Allied naval assault on the Dardanelles Strait, intended to force open a route to Constantinople and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, suffered a catastrophic single day of mine losses that ended the purely naval phase of the campaign and set the stage for the Gallipoli landings. A French pre-dreadnought battleship Bouvet struck a mine while turning and sank in approximately 2 minutes so fast that most of her crew of 7 to 10 men had no time to escape. An estimated 640 men died with her. The British pre-dreadnought HMS Irresistible was also mined and had to be abandoned. Then, HMS Ocean attempted to rescue her crew and was also mined and sunk. In total, 6 Allied warships were sunk or seriously damaged by mines in a single afternoon. The minefield that inflicted this damage had been laid just 2 nights earlier by the small Ottoman mine layer Nusret, working in darkness in a small section of the strait that previous Allied minesweeping had missed. Nusret had laid 26 mines in a line parallel to the shore, rather than perpendicular to it, a configuration that minesweepers operating in the standard pattern had swept around rather than through. The loss of 3 capital ships in an afternoon from 26 mines laid by a single small vessel ended the naval campaign on that day. The subsequent decision to attempt an amphibious landing at Gallipoli instead produced one of the worst Allied military disasters of the war. The Nusret's 26 mines had killed hundreds of men, sunk or disabled 3 capital ships, and redirected the strategic momentum of the entire Dardanelles campaign, all within a single afternoon, at a cost to the Ottomans of a small quantity of ordnance and 1 night of mine laying. The Nusret herself survived the war and was preserved as a museum ship in Turkey, where she is still on display as a symbol of the outsized consequences that a single minesweeping miss can produce. USS Magpie. On September 29, 1950, the American minesweeper USS Magpie exploded after striking a North Korean contact mine off the eastern coast of Korea near Shumonshin, Chan, sinking in minutes. 21 members of her crew of 33 were killed or went missing in the explosion, and sinking, leaving only 12 survivors. It was the first U.S. ship lost in the Korean War and exposed a planning failure of significant strategic consequence. The Korean War's planners had not anticipated the scale of North Korean mine warfare. A Soviet-trained mining program had laid thousands of contact mines in the waters around Korean ports, a density of seabed coverage that American mine-sweeping doctrine and equipment had not prepared for. On October 12, 1950, 2 more American minesweepers, USS Pirate and USS Pledge, struck mines almost simultaneously while clearing Wonsan Harbor, and both sank within minutes, with North Korean shore batteries opening fire on survivors in the water as they waited for rescue. The Wonsan mining had been so extensive that an amphibious landing planned for October 20th had to be delayed an entire week because the harbor could not be cleared in time, prompting Admiral Forrest Sherman to state that the United States had lost control of the sea to a nation that had no navy. The Korean mine crisis was the most embarrassing demonstration in American naval history that a sophisticated naval power could be strategically paralyzed by cheap primitive weapons laid by an opponent with almost no surface fleet capability. HMS Recruit. On August 1st, 1915, the British destroyer HMS Recruit was sunk by a mine in the North Sea, killing 37 of her crew. The destroyer had been tasked with patrol duties in an area where German mine-laying activity had been reported but not fully mapped. Her loss was one of dozens of British destroyer mine casualties during the First World War, a category of loss so regular that the Royal Navy began treating mine damage to destroyers as an expected attrition rate rather than a discrete disaster requiring individual investigation. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Royal Navy lost more ships to mines than to any other single cause, including submarine torpedoes. More than 44 warships and 225 auxiliary vessels were sunk and a significant proportion of these losses were destroyers and minesweepers operating in areas where mine density was high and sweeping technology remained inadequate to guarantee clearance. The accumulated knowledge of where German minefields were located, gathered at immense cost to the minesweeping forces, was one of the most strategically valuable and most expensively acquired pieces of intelligence in the entire naval war. By the end of the conflict, Britain had trained more than 700 vessels and tens of thousands of men for minesweeping duties, a force that dwarfed anything that had existed at the start of the war. Most of these were converted fishing trawlers and their peacetime crews, men from British fishing ports who brought no naval training, but intimate knowledge of how to work in heavy seas at close range to the ocean floor. Wonsan Harbor, Korea. On October 12, 1950, the minesweepers USS Pirate and USS Pledge were conducting mine clearance operations off Sindo Island near the strategically vital port of Wonsan, North Korea, as part of the preparation for a planned amphibious landing when both ships struck mines within minutes of each other. Pirate sank in approximately 5 minutes. Pledge sank within an hour. As survivors struggled in the water, North Korean shore batteries on Sindo Island opened fire on both the men in the water and the rescue vessels attempting to reach them, requiring American carrier aircraft and surface ships to silence the batteries before a full rescue could be mounted. The 4-hour rescue operation ultimately saved 170 men from the 2 ships, but 13 were killed or missing. The mining of Wonsan Harbor represented a level of strategic obstruction that shocked American naval planners. More than 3,000 Soviet-supplied mines had been laid across the approaches to Korean East Coast ports at a cost of approximately $15 each. The mines delayed the Wonsan landing by a week, required the diversion of extensive naval resources, and produced the longest naval blockade in modern history, a 861-day continuous operation that saw 3 more American ships sunk by mines and more than 24 damaged. The Wonsan operation produced one of the most quoted assessments in mine warfare history, the observation that a primitive weapon costing dollars could immobilize a naval force worth billions. USS Samuel B. Roberts. On April 14, 1988, the American guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts was transiting international waters in the central Persian Gulf as part of Operation Earnest, with the American effort to escort reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers through the hazardous waters of the Iran-Iraq tanker war, when lookouts spotted several mines floating in the water. The ship began maneuvering to avoid them. While doing so at 4:45 in the afternoon, an Iranian Sadaf 02 contact mine detonated directly beneath the hull. The explosion ripped a 15-foot hole in the ship's hull, broke the keel, flooded the engine room, and knocked both gas turbine engines off their mounts. The force of the blast threw the commanding officer, Commander Paul Wren, from the bridge wing, breaking his foot. 10 sailors were seriously injured, 4 of them severely burned. The ship came within minutes of sinking. Saved only by a damage control effort that became one of the most studied examples of effective shipboard crisis response in the modern U.S. Navy's history. Commander Wren had spent the preceding months obsessively drilling his crew in damage control procedures, running exercises until the response times were faster than any manual required. Those drills kept the Roberts afloat through the night as the crew fought flooding and fires simultaneously. The ship was eventually loaded onto a heavy lift vessel and transported to Bath, Maine for repairs costing $80.2 million more than the ship's original construction cost. The mine's serial number matched mines seized from an Iranian vessel months earlier, providing the evidence that triggered Operation Praying Mantis. 4 days later, the largest American naval action since World War II. Gulf War mine damaged USS Princeton and USS Tripoli. On February 18, 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, 2 American vessels struck Iraqi mines in the Persian Gulf. In a single day, the most damaging mine incident for the U.S. Navy since Korea. The guided missile cruiser USS Princeton struck a Manta-influenced mine, a modern Italian-designed weapon that detonated beneath the ship's hull using pressure and acoustic triggers rather than physical contact, causing catastrophic structural damage that cracked the ship's superstructure, jammed her rudder, and injured 12 crew members, 3 seriously. Hours later, The helicopter assault ship USS Tripoli, which was serving as the command vessel for the entire mine-clearing operation in the Gulf, also struck a mine, tearing a 20 by 16-foot hole in her hull and injuring 4 crew members. The irony that the ship coordinating the hunt for Iraqi mines was itself mined was not lost on the Navy's subsequent investigation. The Iraqi mine campaign in the 1991 Gulf War demonstrated that even a third world military with basic mining capabilities could inflict significant damage on a technologically superior naval force, and that the United States Navy's organic minesweeping capability had been systematically underfunded since the Korean War. At the time of Desert Storm, the Navy's entire active mine countermeasures force consisted of vessels described by their own crews as inadequate for the threat environment they were operating in. The 2 mine strikes of February 18th prevented Princeton from participating in the amphibious assault on Kuwait and forced a reconsideration of how close to the Kuwaiti coast the landing force could safely position. The planned amphibious landing was ultimately canceled partly because of the mine threat. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.